V. Sriram's book on Fort St. George will be released today. It's his book number 14. A small administrative announcement before I request Mr. Muthaiah to take the floor. It is subscription renewal time. It's usually April, but it will help if members start renewing right away. I request Mr. Muthaiah to make his welcome remarks and also speak briefly about the book and the author.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another meeting of the Madras Book Club. Members and non-members. And the non-members, we hope, will become members before long. If they pay their subscriptions and meet Jayanti up there. 850 rupees for an individual and 1,000 signs. 1,000 for an individual and 1,800.
1,800 for
1,800. All of you all give me wrong information. Okay. Before I do an introduction of the book and Sriram, let me do my usual sales pitch, especially since there are so many newcomers here, and I know Bharat wants to know what all this is about. The Madras Book Club is about nearly 20 years old now, and it was started by a few publishers, and we met in the canteens of publishers in the early days. And if you ever had canteen tea, you'd never go back to a canteen for any kind of meeting. So we virtually closed up at one point in time till the Kumars, who were with the British Council and were retiring at that time, were tied up with the Madras Library Association. I don't think you ever met the Kumars, did you? I don't think so. They're very active in the Madras Library Association, and they got us to the Connemara Hotel, where they used to meet, and where the Connemara Hotel was very generous in giving corporate social responsibility and giving a nominality. With the Connemara Hotel now under renovation for a year, we are very thankful to the GRT for doing the same thing and supporting the Madras Book Club. The book club is the only club that I know of which has no elections, no office bearers or whatever it is. It has a permanent MC, and we pull somebody out from the audience to say thank you at the end of it. And what we promised for your subscription, 1,000 and 1,800, right? Okay. Is at least one meeting a month on a book. Our average for the last 3 years has been 25 meetings a year. That's 2 to 3 meetings a month. And today we have recognized that wherever people from Delhi and Bombay want to launch a book in Madras, is the book club they come to. We also find time occasionally to launch a local book, like today's book. And today's book I'm arm-twisted into that thing because I've been involved in it in some way or another. So let's talk about the book. Sriram will talk about later. 2015 was the 375th year of 4 square walls without any foundations being built, a larger building in the middle with no foundations, and a few thatched huts within that limit. Very grandiosely in April 1640, it was called Fort St. George. It was founded by the East India Company, who had been given 3 square miles of land, where Fort St. George still is, having grown over the years. And that growth story is part of today's book. But in those days, it was basically a trading colony. And I think somewhere along the way, and this is for Bharat's information, the concept of trade got lost, especially in recent years, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. But at the time, from trading colony, Fort St. George grew over the years, and over 3 stages. First, from 1639 till the 1750s, it was a trading outpost, and trade was the total focus of the fort. No different from the multinationals of today, being given a whole lot of concessions and taking away a whole lot of money. Nothing has changed over the years. Subsequently, from the 1740s onwards till 1857, the East India Company began to wield more militaristic influence in India and offered protection to various rajas and kingdoms in India, and spread its tentacles mainly through influence but not through conquest to that extent. 1857 saw what I call the Great Revolt and the birth of the Raj. And over that period, and this is what is very significant and why I'm passionate about Fort St. George and Madras and why Sri Ram is also, virtually every single modern institution in India today had its beginnings in that fort. Whether it was medicine, whether it was engineering, whether it's the education all of us have had, whether it's the surveying of India, you name it, the beginnings were in that fort. It's an immensely significant institution, which I'm glad to hear now that the Archaeological Survey of India are planning, once the army moves out, to do a fair amount of restoration and seek World Heritage status. If any place in India needs World Heritage status, it is Fort St. George. Because what it has contributed to India, modern India, is significant. Over the years then, Fort St. George has grown, become an independent, become the capital of Tamil Nadu, has had a history as part of Tamil Nadu history as such, and it's a fascinating story that has to be told. In the fort, there are about 30 major buildings, and out of those major buildings, 16 buildings are protected buildings. Not very well protected, but nevertheless protected. For instance, Wellesley House collapsed in 1980, I think it was, and is still collapsed. However, part of the house still remained and was still occupied from last time I knew about it. So next time you go there, Bharat, please have a look at the occupied area of Wellesley House. So there is much in the fort which is of historical interest and things like that. It's something that you need to go and visit as such. Now, to celebrate 375 years of Fort St. George, which no one has thought of celebrating, and at the same time to celebrate 25 years of Madras musics, which only Madras music thought of celebrating, we decided to run from 2015 a series of articles on the front page of Fort St. George written by Sri Ram, and it ran for 24 issues, all 24 issues as such. It covers every single major building in the fort and a lot of the minor buildings also. And if you know Sri Ram, all the talk of buildings is connected with storytelling, which may or may not be true. But anyway, it was a delightful read as such. So one fine day we got together and said, why don't we get it published? It's something which is worthwhile. And Sri Ram looked at it slightly differently from me. I look at it as a record of what we needed to do. Sri Ram said, here is a walking guide. You take this book, read it, and you can walk around Fort St. George and find out everything you need to know about the fort. So that is what it is. And making it possible was where that man hiding somewhere, Chellappan or Palyappa Brothers. Palyappa Brothers is the leading Tamil publishing house in this place, but in the last 5 or 6 years they have got into English publishing on an experimental basis, and this is what going to be a very successful experiment, is the Guide to Fort St. George. Now, Sri Ram has had one advantage over me. Sri Ram belongs to the computer age. And though he the other day spotted and photographed me sitting at a computer and pecking away with one, you got the picture I hope, one figure at a time, he uses it like a wizard. And the result is today, there is a tremendous amount of material in book form on the computer. my day, it was looking at the archives or looking at libraries here or looking at libraries in London and struggling to take down notes and things like that. My entire period, whenever I visited London at the British Library, was painstakingly taking down notes because I couldn't afford their Xeroxing costs. So, I said, they have the most highest cost that I know of anywhere in the world. This is something you should take up sometime. Especially looking at places like us. And Sriram has therefore collected far more information than I've ever collected on Madras as such. And that is what is poured out in this book. As for Sriram, he loves to be called an entrepreneur. I've just discovered his entrepreneurship is due to his father-in-law, Mr. N. Krishnan, who has just written a book about his entrepreneurship. And N. Krishnan, where are you? Missing. Ah, there you are, very good. Right. Good book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, especially the industrial part of it. And Sriram, when he finds time, when he's not taking walks, when he's not writing, when he's not doing something, pays a little attention to the business. Thankfully, it's been a successful business due to Mr. Krishnan, and Sriram has had an entirely enjoyable ride with it. But as I said, much of his time is spent on writing on a whole range of things. Madras is not his only love. His greater love is Carnatic music and the history of music and dance in the South. Which is your first love?
Madras. She's sitting there.
Anyway, Sarda, you did better than Baldi used to do. So, Carnatic music is written quite a bit about, and then books which have come out on Carnatic music and then now the Madras is there. Several corporate histories and biographies of people have all come out of Sriram's pen. And we hope he keeps on writing and keeping things. From my point of view, I hope he keeps on staying with Madras musings. And we have finished 25 years, we're looking forward to the next 25 years. Thanks to Sriram. So, is that enough of an introduction? Okay, right. Okay, with that, I hand over to Madhav. Thank you all very much.
Friends, I now request Sriram to talk about the book. Mr. Muthaiah mentioned his computer expertise, but I should tell you about his cell phone. I think his cell phone is a treasury, is a reservoir of wealth about Madras, about music, about so many other things. And this is his book number 14. Both he and Mr. Muthaiah are two of the most prolific writers in Chennai. Mr. Muthaiah has written, I think, about 40 books, I have lost count. And Sriram is now on book number 14. And both of them managed to churn out one book a year. And I don't know how they do it. Over to Sriram.
Thank you, Mr. Madhu. And thanks, Mr. Muthaiah, for that introduction. I will extract my pound of flesh in the short and snappy column of the next issue. Thank you, Bharat, and thank you, Nirmala, for agreeing to be a part of this book release, which means so much to me. Fort St. George has always been very special to me. I can never forget my first visit there when I was 6, and Dad, who is in the audience, took me to visit the fort. And I can still remember the Cornwallis statue, because I must have been that high, and the statue towering over me in the stairwell of the museum building in the fort. And that was my first visit, and that memory of that of the statue and the church kind of remained with me till I came back to Madras in 1993 and then resumed my connection with Fort St. George. Fortunately, I didn't have to go there either as an employee or as a supplicant. I just had to go there as a casual visitor, and I hope to remain that way. Once I got involved in the history of our city, I found that there were plenty of sources to kind of look at as far as the history of the fort is concerned, and perhaps one of the best is Mr. Muthaiya's Madras Rediscovered, where there is an entire chapter, the fort where it all began. And the same, in that vein, several of his other books also, including Madras Past and Present, which carries a photographic history of the city, also kind of takes that forward. Much later, we had Kalpana and Frank Schiffer's book published by Intac. It's called Madras, the Architectural Heritage, and I think that's one of the finest books we have ever had on our city's built history. And that again devotes several pages to Fort St. George across the first section of the book. And those were some of the places where I began acquiring information about the fort. In recent years, we've had Nirmala's book, Degree Coffee by the Yard, which again has a lot of anecdotal history regarding Fort St. George, and Bishwanath Ghosh's book, Tamarind City, which again devotes a section to Fort St. George. But what I realized was that most people in the city and most visitors to the city, in fact, I would say more people in the city and a fewer number of visitors to the city give Fort St. George a complete miss. They, in fact, if at all there are people who are interested in going to the fort, it is the people who come from the west. They are the people who invariably come searching for an ancestor, searching for a common surname, something that they have read. Indians, by and large, don't like to go to Fort St. George. And the peculiar thing is that most people in the city also assume that it is out of bounds for visitors. So the standard question is, how do you go there so often? Do you have permission? What happens? Actually, the surprising thing is you don't need any permission. Anybody can go to Fort St. George. And it's just that the entry process is a little intimidating. But if you have ever been to the High Court or if you have been to any government department, you have the same degree of intimidation for getting into Fort St. George. So there is a narrow pathway through which, if you are not one of the people with pennants and flags flying on your bonnet, then you are shooed in, but then otherwise you are shooed out, and then you are made to go through a side entrance where there is a very grubby register where you have to enter your name and your full address and your phone number, and they look at you as though you've come to bomb the fort. But thereafter, they are friendliness personified, and once you say, there are two magic words that you have to utter. What have you come for is the first question. Church and museum. You just have to say these two things. If you offer any extra word, then it will be held against you. But the moment you say church and museum, they let you in at once. They never ask you any further questions, and then you go into a metal detector where a man kind of frisks you or a woman frisks you, and then thereafter, you can wander around the fort for any number of hours till closing time. There is nobody who really bothers with what you're doing, and as long as you stay clear of the parts that say entry strictly prohibited or enter at your own risk or whatever, and so those places, as long as you avoid, you are completely free to wander around the fort. And this is what I have been doing for several years. Taking people on heritage tours, going by myself to look up certain buildings, and then during the course of this particular series that we were doing in Madras Musings, carrying a camera and going around taking photographs with my iPad. And that is what I did, and I don't think anybody stopped me at any point in time. The fort itself is very lucky in the sense that it has had any number of people who have documented it over the years. The best known perhaps is H.D. Love's Vestiges of Old Madras, which was written in 1913, and a substantial part of the book deals with the fort's history. And then you have Emily Frank Penny, who wrote a fairly patronizing book on Madras and writes a fairly patronizing account of the fort as well. Then Glyn Barlow, Talboys Wheeler, who perhaps was the predecessor to most of these people in terms of writing. And then when I sat with Mr. Muthaiya, he came up with a name that I had never come across before. David Layton's Vicissitudes of Fort St. George. And this was a book that I was lucky enough to find a free copy on the internet, and so I was able to download that. And all of these kind of gave a lot of information about the fort. But the real stories are not in any of these historic documentations. So if you want to look for scandals,
N.S. Ramasamy.
N.S. Ramasamy later, post-independence, before Mr. Muttaya, N.S. Ramasamy's documentation. But if you want to look for scandals, then you've got to look at private documentation, biographies of the various governors who have lived in Fort St. George, the army officers who lived there. And as I began documenting this book, I realized that human nature hasn't changed in 400 years. So corruption was as corrupt as it was then as it is now. Yale, in fact, would have taught a few people of the current generation a thing or two as far as corruption was concerned. Land grab. In fact, the first recorded instance of land grab goes back to the 1670s, when it says Governor Edward Winter has taken a part of the public thoroughfare in the fort and extended his residence on it. And it's only after he leaves that they demolish that particular portion and restore the thoroughfare for people to go through. Then the government cars kind of arrogating the road and demanding right of way against the interests of the public. So there is the Valaja gate, which is actually a one-way. So you can only come into the fort via the Valaja gate, you can't go out through the Valaja gate. And this is how it has been historically. But not for the Marquis of Tweeddale, who was the governor of Madras. So one afternoon, in a great hurry, rushing his carriage through the gate to find a civilian coming in the opposite direction. And both the carriages meet under the Valaja gate. No idea as to who is going to move first. So the civilian gets off, though he is really right as per law, and tries to get his carriage to move, but his horse is made of sterner stuff and refuses to move. Whereupon the Marquis orders the impounding of the offending vehicle. So the security guards immediately impound the civilian's carriage. Marquis of Tweeddale goes through to Government House, and then in the evening the civilian comes, pays a fine and collects his vehicle for something that he really did not, for an offence that he did not really commit. And then Swachh Bharat. There are several records of public defecation in the fort right through the 18th and 19th century. It says it's a shameful matter that there are only 5 toilets for 700 officers and most of them are using the open. So toilets keep getting constructed repeatedly, but the numbers are always woefully less as compared to what they ought to be. So all these things have happened in Fort St. George. So when Mr. Muttaya says that in many ways it's the birthplace of modern India, it is the birthplace of modern India. Lots of modern India is there. And then you have the other stories as well. So you've got the Flagstaff, which is supposed to be the tallest Flagstaff in the entire country. And we have the story of Tara Murali's granduncle, Bhashyam, climbing up all the 175 feet on January 26, 1930, tearing down the Union Jack, hoisting the Congress flag, and then climbing down to wait to see a set of policemen waiting underneath. So comes down up to 20 feet and then jumps on the policemen and beats them up and finally gets arrested and is hailed before the magistrate in Georgetown, whereupon he is told that, you know, you can express an apology and you'll be let off. And he says, not only will I not express an apology, I will also express my delight that I bashed up so many policemen. Whereupon he is sentenced. And then comes out many years later, refuses a freedom fighter's pension and ekes out a living by painting the portraits of Subramanya Bharati and Mahatma Gandhi. And today the portrait of Subramanya Bharati that hangs in the Madras legislature, Tamil Nadu legislature, is done by Arya Bhashyam. So that is, I think, a fascinating story. Equally fascinating is the fact that among all the flags that were hoisted in India on August 15, 1947, the only surviving specimen is in Fort St. George. And it is, it's in the 3rd floor of the museum. It is very much there. And then you've got the other stories as well, which I think only a very sensible bureaucracy could have achieved this kind of a history. So you have Cornwallis coming down to Madras in 1792, defeating Tipu Sultan, going off to Calcutta as Governor General, and then the public of Madras getting together to subscribe to get a statue done for Cornwallis. So in 1801, the statue arrives from London and is unveiled and put in the Barracks Square, which is the west-facing portion behind the Secretariat of Fort St. George, under a granite canopy that was made here for it. So the canopy, a rotunda, and then underneath the statue. And then in 1804 or 1805, Cornwallis comes back for a second time to India as Governor General, this time arrives first in Madras, and as Nirmala writes in her book, walks up to his statue, inspects the parade and salutes his own statue and gives a speech. And then goes off to Calcutta, where he dies a year later of Bengal liver and is buried in a place called Ghazipur. And then the residents of Madras decide that this man deserves a bigger memorial because he defeated Tipu Sultan. So they subscribe for a huge cenotaph and decide that the statue should be moved to the cenotaph. So the cenotaph is put up by the 1820s at the intersection of Tenampet and Mount Road, so that road becomes Cenotaph Road. But the statue never makes a move. The statue remains in Fort St. George, cenotaph remains in Cenotaph Road. And then every time the government wakes up and says, yes, yes, we have to move the statue, we have to move the statue. But it's finally in 1905, a good 100 years later, that they decide that yes, it's time to move the statue. But the cenotaph is no longer on Cenotaph Road. Some 20 years earlier, I have no idea how they managed it. With crowbar and axe, they have actually excavated the cenotaph and shifted it all the way to First Line Beach, where it is standing in front of the GPO. So the statue has to now move to the GPO instead of moving to Cenotaph Road. So statue makes the move and comes in 1905 to stand under the cenotaph, only to discover a year later that the salt from the harbour is eating the marble. So the statue has to be moved once again. So statue now moves to the Connemara Public Library, where it remains till independence. After independence, Rajaji says, we don't want that statue there, shift it back to Fort St. George. Now the best position to shift it would be the rotunda, which is still lying there in Barrack Square. But the rotunda is no longer there. It has shifted to the front of the fort in the 1930s, where it now remains. Finally, statue makes the journey back in 1955 and is not put inside the rotunda, but is put in the Exchange Museum. So there is a 30 feet distance between statue and rotunda. Rotunda, which could have held the statue happily under it, is remaining empty. Statue is inside the Fort Museum. Cenotaph is remaining outside GPO, where people are urinating inside it every day. So this is how the history of the fort has come to be written. And then you've got the Pallavaram Gneiss story, you know, the pillars which now mark the 32 pillars that stand all around the assembly building. Now they have a history by themselves. You know, originally I think it was Thomas Pitt or George Morton Pitt, one of the two Pitts. They created a colonnade leading all the way from the sea to the fort, so that any governor who comes in after being seasick will muster all his dignity and walk down in grandeur down the colonnade. The colonnade then is sacked by the French in 1746 and taken off to Pondicherry. And then in the 1760s, when Ayar Koot goes and ransacks Pondicherry, he brings the colonnade back. The colonnade is now assembled like a hall, so that people can meet in it. Finally, nobody needs it, but because they don't want to do away with those columns, when the assembly building is built, they incorporate the columns inside and they are standing. So in that time, they have moved from Pallavaram to Fort to Pondicherry and back. If only these columns could have spoken, I wonder what kind of a story they would have had to say about what they have done. So that is really the kind of thing that I discovered as I went along on this journey of writing the history of the fort. When the book had to be printed, I had this great fortune of meeting up with Mr. Chellappan, thanks to Mr. Muttaya, who introduced me. And he was the one who first kind of came up with this idea that this book had to be kept light. All my earlier books have been remarkably heavy. In fact, the last book was released by the President of India and nobody warned him about the weight of the book. So when it was given to him, he just went like that. And then had to be held up by 2 security guards, and then the book had to be released. So the speech was mercifully brief after the book had been released, principally because of the shock that we had given the system. But this book is intended to be carried by people so that they can go around the fort. It's got a map at the back, so that you have an idea of every monument that is covered in the book itself. And so we will no longer have tourists walking around like this in the fort. They have no idea what they are seeing at any given point of time. The only time they react in a human fashion is when a guard comes and says, "Shh, go, you can't stand here, you can't stand here." So at least now they have a book that they can look into so that they know where they are going. Yoga from Pioneerpa Brothers was the one who really worked on the map and on the design, and I am very grateful to him for what he did. And finally, I decided that the book, even though it's a small book, needs an index because it's full of places and place names. So in case you want to see what Yale did, what Yale should not have done, what Yale ought to have done, all of it is there. In fact, Yale kind of spans the whole book. I suddenly realized that. So this is a book that I would like people to take with their children, like the way my father did so many years ago, and grandparents to take their grandchildren. These days, grandparents are forever watching TV serials. But the idea is that and grandchildren are looking at iPads. But if only they did, I think our history would come alive and we'll have a lot more people with an appreciation of history, at least in the future generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sriram. That was characteristically delightful. Now, it's time for release of the book. May I request Mr. Bharat Joshi to release the book and hand over the first copy to Mrs. Nirmala Lakshman.
There's just one more person I'd like you to give a copy of the book. That is Dr. Vijay Sriram. He's here. Dr. Vijay was the one who came with me to the fort and photographed each of the monuments for the book, especially. And so I'd just like you to hand over a copy to him also. Thank you very much, Vijay, for having been a part of this.
Thank you, Mr. Joshi. Mrs. Nirmala Lakshman will now speak. A few words about her. She is a director of the Hindu Group of Publications. She has a PhD in modern fiction from Madras University and a master's degree from the US. She has held senior positions in the Hindu for more than 3 decades. She launched and curated the Hindu's literary festival, Lit for Life. She is the author of a delightful short biography of Madras titled Degree Coffee by the Yard that has been deservedly very popular. Over to Mrs. Lakshman.
Good evening. I told Sriram that after somebody like him speaks and after Mr. Muthiah that I would only say a few words, because in the presence of somebody like him who's the raconteur par excellence and who's also been a mentor of sorts for me as I did my own journey to collect information for my book, I think it's not appropriate for me to say too much, but I'd like to congratulate him and I'd like to thank Mr. Muthiah also for being a mentor to both of us and for having helped us on our own various journeys looking for this book. As he said, Sriram is not just a raconteur but a spiced up raconteur. And I think his speech and the things that he said and the narratives that and the stories that he tells have always shown us that there's been a lot of color that's gone on, whether it's about Lahu, Yale's life, or Benfield, one of his obviously favorite characters. He's talked about corruption in high places and the history of that continues till this day. And more than anything, I think it's been his penetrating insights, his deeply informative knowledge, his commitment and his passion to the city of Madras, his interest in heritage, in history and in music that has kept us all captivated over the last couple of decades. and I understand it's the 14th book, so we're looking forward to many more from him. And I must say that recently he said in a tweet that his admirers seem to be only strange ladies from faraway countries. I saw that today, and I'd like to assure him that there are hordes of people, including people in this audience, who are willing to go to great lengths and follow him on foot and in buses and cars and trains across not just the city but across Tamil Nadu in search of understanding more about our culture and our history. And we're very grateful to him for having set the pace for us, so to speak. And of course it follows in the footsteps of the illustrious, distinguished historian Mr. Muthiah, who has been a mentor for all of us, for many of us. I'd also like to say that the whole concept of looking at the city has really become something that's been very invested in by a lot of people in the city, simply because of the pioneering efforts of not just people like Mr. Muthiah and Sriram, but also a lot of other people who've got together to create the Madras Week. People like, Mr. Vincent D'Souza, Sushila, who's here, and Sashi Nair, and others who have gone to a lot of efforts to bring together the history and the culture of this city, and have taken forward and made this something that's owned by the people rather than making it an exclusive, tourist cachet. And it's been something that's opened up to everyone. And I think it goes beyond the Madras Week and allows us as citizens to claim the history and the greatness of our own city. I'd like to just mention one more thing about Sriram, because when I was doing research for my own book, what struck me most was the great generosity of spirit with which he shared his knowledge and his insight with me, and I'm truly grateful for that, because I think that's the mark of a real intellectual, when you're able to share what you know and pass on the values that you have, so that everyone can be part of this exciting journey. And I'm looking forward to many more treasures from him, and I'm sure he'll share them with all of us. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mrs. Lakshman. May I now request Mr. Bharat Joshi to speak a few words about him. He is the British Deputy High Commissioner in Chennai. He was most recently British High Commissioner to Cameroon. He had postings in Gambia, Bangladesh and Qatar. He has worked as private secretary to 2 British ministers. Mr. Joshi has been a troubleshooter for his government during crises. When the British Consulate General in Istanbul was bombed in 2003, he was deployed there. In Chennai, he focuses on enhancing the trade and investment partnership between UK on the one hand and Tamil Nadu, Kerala and Pondicherry on the other. His interests include cricket, badminton, history, reading and traveling. He speaks English, French, Gujarati, Hindi and Spanish, and is learning to speak Tamil. Over to Mr. Joshi.
I have to say, I think it's really unfair to ask me to speak last after these two, so I don't promise to be neither as entertaining nor as erudite as my 2 previous speakers. I must say I was very impressed at the beginning that you started talking about the fees for membership at the beginning. Usually, when we ask for fees for our club, there's a big exodus of people towards the door. I'm very impressed that nobody left this room. Thank you for the invitation. We've been in this city for 3.5 years, and you get to a point where you think you know everyone. And I'm amazed, there are lots of old friends here, but there are also lots of new faces and new friends for us to meet. And to see a group like this, which has come together around that shared love of reading and of books, which is a love that I absolutely share. I still treasure those days. I still haven't got a Kindle. I know you won't know what a Kindle is. We will show you later. But I still like the feel of a book in my hand, and there's nothing that touches that. And it's magical for me, and to be in a city which shares that love is something that's quite special for us. This is an absolutely unique city. We've had the pleasure, because of our work, to live in many places, and we are always, whenever anyone comes to us, after 3.5 years, people still come and ask us, how do you like Chennai? And it's always as if they expect us to say, oh no, the weather's terrible. But our answer always has been, since we arrived in this city, we love Chennai. We knew about India before we came, but we just love the people, we love, many of whom are here, the levels of the warmth, the genuine way in which people welcome you into their homes and into their hearts. The fact that so many people are here are Renaissance people, so people who worked in industry and then went into history, or Sriram, you're the same, but everyone, nobody here does one thing. Irritatingly, they're very good at 2 or 3 different things, which is really hard for other people to live up to, but it makes it a magical city. But the other thing is the history, and I don't think we talk enough about the history. I know it feels sometimes as if you're fighting a losing battle to try and remember what this city was. And I remember when I first read Madras Rediscovered, it occurred to me that it's faintly ludicrous that this city exists. I mean, this was probably one of the most inhospitable bits of land anywhere. If you were going to start an empire, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't sort of put out a map and go there. It wouldn't happen. It's all to do with where your girlfriend lives about 4 miles away, so you just want to be close to her. It's crazy that the city exists, and to see what grew out of this inhospitable piece of land, which, as you said, was driven by business, for me is miraculous. And to forget that means that you lose a part of your soul. The people of this city will lose a part of their soul if they forget that. So I'm so pleased that you are trying to keep that dream alive. Every time we drive around the city, and there are pieces of hidden history. I was driving the other day and I'd never seen this Goshen Library before. So I wanted to have a conversation with you and understand what that is, because I didn't know it was there before. So it is a really spectacular city. I will just say one thing about the UK-India relationship, just so that my bosses feel that I'm earning my money. I am not the best person. You can see quite obviously, I am not the best person to apologise for some of the excesses of colonial history. I have to say I'm very ambivalent about some of the things that were done in this country in the name of the country for whom I am now working and a proud national of. I do think, though, that relationship has changed. And I was in November, I was with our Prime Minister in Delhi, where she said, and I think it's the first time I've heard a UK Prime Minister use these words, she said, we want a partnership of equals with India. And I think that, for me, symbolises where our relationship now is. That there was absolutely a time when we saw India through the prism of what India could do for the empire. I don't think that's true anymore. We see India as a global force for good, both in economic terms, and that's to do with the size of the economy and the pace at which it's growing, but also as a force for good in terms of politics. We want to see India on the Security Council. We want to see India as a force for stability within its own immediate neighbourhood, and we want to contribute to that. So I am here because I want to be a part of that partnership of equals. And I think people forget that UK companies, UK is the largest investor into India. And we create the largest number of jobs. So 1 in 20 formal jobs in India are created by UK companies. And they are good quality jobs, and that's because increasingly when you meet UK companies, if you talk to the big UK companies, you don't meet British people. You know, I'm not going to name any other countries, but you do not see lots of British people here working for UK companies. We employ Indians, and often we take those Indians elsewhere to work for those same companies globally, and that's because the talent is here. We don't need to bring British people to do those jobs. We can find it locally. Finally, to say something about the book, I've read about half of it. We are very regular visitors to the fort. We always take our visitors there. You'll be pleased to know we don't go with the flag flying. We actually do go through that little gate. Besides, our names are in the book. We love the church. It's an extraordinary place, and that goes. It's actually, we first went because it was this, oldest church east of Suez, and one of the things, we have lots of ministers coming here, and you always scratch your head, where do we take our ministers? So we always take them to the church. They seem to love it, but actually it's a really magical church. There's something very special about that church and the history that resides within it. And we have the pleasure of going there once a year because our Remembrance Day ceremony for all of those who sacrificed their lives, many of whom, of course, were Indian. We do that remembrance ceremony in that church. So it's a spectacular place. We don't go there often enough. We keep saying we want to spend some more time in the museum, so we've been a few times. We've actually, the government art collection has lent some pictures to the museum. So every now and then someone comes from London just to see whether or not they're still there and how badly damaged they are. And one of the challenges for us is to work out whether there's more that we can do to help publicise what's there, whether there's something we can do with government to try and find a way, for example, to help with the restoration of some of those buildings. Because as much as this is a part of Chennai, it's at the heart of the UK-India relationship. Our relationship with India fundamentally, realistically, and it's sort of Surat, but it started here in Chennai. And so I think we have an obligation to try and support whatever work is done around helping those buildings. So it's a conversation we've started having, we've never finished, but it's something I genuinely, personally think we would commit to. And I'm sure I have a lot of UK companies who would feel the same way. So congratulations, Sridham. It looks like a great book. You will see me walking around Port St. George with this book. And thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi. It's now question time. Please feel free to ask questions. And the ground rules laid by Mr. Muthaiya are one question per person, and please make it a question rather than a statement. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Sir, this is not a question, a doubt. I remember to read somewhere a royal member of the Ramanatha Samasthanam revolted against British, and he was imprisoned, and he was put in prison till his death. Is it so?
Yeah, it is correct. It is just that it is not in this book because I could not locate the place where it happened. There is no trace of a prison anymore in Fort St. George. But it is very well documented that he was kept a prisoner there till he died. There is no doubt about it. Ramanathapuram, say it. That way, thanks for bringing it up. There are some stories that I discovered only after I did the book. For instance, two stories concerning General Thimayya, who was a general in the army post-independence. I believe Thimayya had joined the army even before, and so there were no Indian officers allowed to live in the King's barracks. So it was Thimayya who first fought for his rights and became an officer who was Indian officer who was allowed to live in the King's barracks. And there he entertained a girl once and told her that when she left the fort, he would ensure that there was a 101 gun salute in her honor. And so that evening, as the girl left the fort, all the 101 guns went off. And then there was an inquiry against Thimayya, whereupon he said, I was asked to check the conditions of the guns. And he was commended and promoted thereafter. That didn't make it to the fight. I also forgot to mention that all proceeds from the sale of this book go to Chennai Heritage, which brings out the
Any more questions? If there are no more questions, then we will.
Yes, Mr. Tan.
How long did it
No
take
question.
to build the entire
Comment.
buildings? How many years?
The fort started in 1640, but the bulk of the construction was actually completed only by 1780 or so. In the middle, there were several attacks, so substantial, for instance, the French occupation between 1746 and 49 destroyed most of the fort. Then there was a siege by the French in 1758. That again kind of put the clock back. So it was only in the between 1760 and 1780 they completed the fortifications and never had a war after that. So it was in a way a wasted expenditure. Yeah.
This is more a suggestion. I think if we have to attract the present electronic age kids to history, you must do a video work.
I I think so.
which they can download from YouTube or some tube, and then give them a link to the book. Don't exhaust all your stories, just titillate them enough and say more follows, and then make them read the book.
Yale will be one man enough to titillate them.
Is there any part of the fort which is occupied by the armed forces which you have not gone to? And
I couldn't go. I'm looking forward to your taking me there one day.
I think it's very essential because there are nuggets of information.
Shankar is an army officer, so he'll be able to take me there one day. I look forward.
And it's very essential that that has to be documented. And not everywhere an army is, trying to degenerate the place and things like that. And I think we've lost the parts of the Red Fort because after our armies moved down, it's actually gone bad, actually. So if the army is still there in the fort, maybe it'll be good.
Thanks, sir.
Basic question. Who claims ownership to the fort? The government of India, Tamil Nadu, or the British?
There are lots of people. So there is the Legislative Assembly, which is an entity by itself, the government of Tamil Nadu, the army, the navy, and the Archaeological Survey of India. Which is why there is a lot of grey area in the maintenance of the fort today.
The shortage of washrooms or bathrooms, is that in a lighter way, said in a lighter way, or is it true that...
It's a serious documentation. In fact, they have...
what's the reason for it?
I just feel that conventionally we never believed that we needed to construct a number of toilets. Anyway, but that's beside, I'll tell that story out off the dice. But the point is that it is continuously documented in the history of Fort St. George. There are House of Commons questions asked about toilet conditions, and repeatedly this point comes up that it's not sufficient to cater to the number of officers who are working there as officers. So then look at the sepoys and what would their conditions be.
Yes. Yes, please.
Are there any ghost stories associated with the fort? Any celebrity ghosts?
That's a wonderful question. I did not come across any ghost, unlike Calcutta where we have the Hastings ghost and Philip Francis ghost coming to visit Belvedere and all that. But there isn't really any ghost story. But after 5:30, if you happen to be there, you can believe very well that there are ghosts all around the place because it's so deserted by that time.
Mr. Muthaiya has a comment.
I'm breaking my own rule.
Since there are no other questions and we have a few minutes left, I wanted to make a few comments on this whole thing. One is, since this question was raised about army occupation, the fort ownership and the board which sits on this is the legislature, which is represented by the Speaker, the Tamil Nadu Archaeological Department and the Archaeological Survey of India, the Army, and the vestry of the church. We're all involved in this and they can never get down together and solve any problem. But as I mentioned earlier, now there's talk of the army leaving. I've had the good fortune, being of an earlier vintage than Sriram, of having gone through most of those army buildings. And despite the army claiming that they look after all their buildings very well, it's purely a comparative statement. Many of those buildings, especially King's Barracks, which we all know is an absolute mess. And I think whether the Archaeological Survey is going to do better than this or not, I don't know. But the army certainly has not over the years done a job as much as it has done at Fort William in Calcutta, which has also been done. Fort William is brilliant in Calcutta. But for some strange reason, Fort St. George has been completely neglected by the army as such. We're talking of Wellesley House there with Bharat earlier. Part of it is still occupied. But ever since it fell down, nobody can get together to solve the problem of how to restore the house. The Grand Arsenal, that's again, half of it is falling apart and such. And you keep on saying that we look after it, and I think this is where we need to look at. The army needs to take a much stronger view of this. The second comment I have is to Bharat. I'm delighted that Britain today leads the race in investment. But there were the grand old East India days when Britain led everybody. Then subsequently during the 19th century and 20th century, Britain had a head start in investment in India. It did extremely well. Post-independence, Britain was way behind anybody else. And this went on for many, many years. And I'm delighted to hear that at last Britain is beginning to show an interest once again in India in terms of investment. I think Bharat has had something to do with a lot of it in the south as such. So thank you very much, Bharat.
We have two mementos for Mr. Bharat Joshi and Dr. Nirmala Lakshman. I request Sharda Sriram to present the mementos. I take pleasure in thanking Mr. Bharat Joshi and Mrs. Nirmala Lakshman for their short and sweet speeches. And Sriram, of course, belongs to the Madras Book Club, but he is the author, so I thank him for another excellent book. And I thank the GRT for their excellent arrangements. And I thank all of you for coming. And the next meeting, we'll keep you informed. Thank you very much and have a good night.
Any announcement?